Have you ever wondered what happens when the powerless hold the only key to salvation? When those deemed worthless by society become the last hope for the powerful? This is not a fairy tale. This is not folklore. This is the true account of Samuel, a 12-year-old boy whose hands carried knowledge that white medicine could not comprehend, whose kneeling posture concealed a power that would shake the foundations of Whitmore Plantation in Beaufort County, South Carolina. In 1847, when the daughter of the most feared plantation owner lay dying, and every doctor from Charleston to Savannah had declared her case hopeless, something impossible happened in the slave quarters, something that would change the rules of survival forever. If you are ready to witness a story that will challenge everything you think you know about power, justice, and the price of healing, stay with me until the very end. You are about to discover why some truths can only be spoken in whispers, why some names are remembered in songs never written down, and why the most dangerous gift a slave could possess was the ability to save a master's life. Hit that like button if you believe some stories must never be forgotten, and subscribe, because what I am about to reveal will leave you questioning the very nature of mercy and revenge. This is the case that medical history tried to erase, the miracle that became a curse, the healing that ignited a fire across the American South. The ruins of Whitmore Plantation still stand along the Savannah River, half swallowed by kudzu vines and Spanish moss, the columned porch cracked like broken teeth against the Carolina sky. Walk those grounds today and you can still smell it, that thick combination of river mud, rotting magnolia blossoms, and something darker, something that seeps from the soil itself. The slave quarters, nothing but foundation stones now, form a perfect semicircle behind where the great house once commanded the landscape. Local historians will tell you about cotton yields, about architectural significance, about the Whitmore family's prominence in antebellum society. But they will not tell you about the night in August 1847 when a 12-year-old boy walked barefoot across that same ground, carrying a knowledge that would prove more powerful than any whip, any chain, any law written in Charleston or Washington. They will not tell you that on that night, the entire architecture of power, of who possessed value and who could be discarded, collapsed in a single moment of desperate need, because there exists a terrible truth that America has spent centuries trying to bury. Sometimes the only thing standing between the master and death is the very person he has spent a lifetime breaking. And when that moment arrives, when all the doctors with their Latin degrees and bloodletting kits have failed, when the finest physicians from 3 states have declared the case hopeless, the question becomes unbearably simple. Who truly holds the power? The one who owns the land, or the one who knows which root from that land can pull a soul back from the edge of the grave? This is the story of that collision, of that terrible inversion, of the night when Margaret Whitmore, 17 years old, lay dying in her canopied bed while her father discovered that salvation wore the face of a child he had never bothered to see. If you want to follow more cases like this, stories that shook entire societies and revealed hidden truths, subscribe to this channel so you never miss an investigation. Whitmore Plantation stretched across 4,000 acres of prime South Carolina lowcountry, 263 souls held in bondage working rice fields that flooded twice daily with tidal water from the Savannah River. The great house rose 3 stories, 12 rooms wrapped around a central staircase of imported mahogany, its eastern windows positioned to catch the first light over the water, while the western gallery remained perpetually shaded against the brutal afternoon heat. Master Joshua Whitmore ruled this empire with mathematical precision, his ledgers recording every pound of rice, every birth, every death, every dollar extracted from soil and flesh. The rice fields themselves operated on a task system, each enslaved person assigned specific sections to prepare, plant, flood, drain, weed, and harvest, according to the rhythms of the tide and the demands of the Charleston market. Before dawn, the conch shell would sound across the quarters, and by first light, bodies would already be bent in the flooded fields, water reaching their knees as they worked the red rice that had made the Whitmore fortune. The overseer, a man named Thaddeus Crenshaw, rode the field roads on a gray mare, his whip coiled at his saddle, his presence alone enough to quicken the pace of even the most exhausted worker. In the processing barn, women separated grain from chaff in clouds of golden dust that coated their lungs and turned their coughs into percussion that marked the passing hours. The blacksmith shop rang with the sound of iron being shaped into tools, into chains, into the infrastructure of control. Kitchen smoke rose perpetually from behind the great house, where enslaved cooks transformed the plantation's abundance into elaborate meals they would never taste. At night, the quarters came alive with different sounds, the exhausted murmur of bodies trying to recover enough strength to face another dawn, the songs that carried coded messages about who had been sold, who had been whipped, who had tried to run. Children who were too young to work the fields served in the house, learning to move like shadows, to anticipate needs before they were spoken, to become invisible even as they stood in plain sight. And above it all, the great house glowed with lamplight and laughter, its inhabitants utterly convinced of the natural order that placed them in those illuminated rooms, while others slept on dirt floors in structures that barely kept out the rain. But beneath that supposed order, in the spaces between the overseer's rounds, in the knowledge passed from the old ones to the young, in the midnight gatherings where African words still shaped prayers the masters could not understand, a different structure existed, one built on memory and survival and a wisdom that predated the plantation itself. Samuel had been born in the quarters 12 years earlier, his mother Abina, a house servant who carried herself with a stillness that made even Crenshaw uneasy. From the moment he could walk, the boy had moved differently, had watched differently, his eyes tracking patterns others missed. While other children played in the brief hours before they were old enough to work, Samuel would disappear into the edges of the plantation, into the cypress swamps where the rice fields gave way to tangled wilderness, into the pine barrens where enslaved people were not supposed to venture. The old women noticed first how he would return with plants wrapped carefully in torn cloth, how he would sit outside their cabins at night listening to their stories about roots and remedies, about which bark could stop bleeding and which leaves could break a fever. His mother had taught him to move between worlds, to shuffle and lower his eyes in the presence of white people while maintaining an interior space they could never touch. In the great house, Samuel served as a general errand boy, fetching water, stoking fires, carrying messages between rooms, his small size and quick movements making him useful without being threatening. He learned to read the white family's moods in the set of their shoulders, in the tone of their voices, developing an almost supernatural ability to anticipate what would be needed before the request was made. But his true education happened in the swamps and in the quarters, where Abina's mother, a woman everyone called Grandmother Isi, taught him the knowledge she had carried across the ocean from the Gold Coast 40 years earlier. She showed him how to identify devil's shoestring root by its vine pattern, how to prepare sassafras bark for blood purification, how to combine Jimson weed and mullein for respiratory ailments, how to read the body's signs in the color of the tongue, the smell of the breath, the texture of the skin. By the age of 10, Samuel could cure common fevers, treat cuts that would otherwise fester in the humid climate, ease the chronic pain that plagued older field workers. He worked in secret, treating people after dark in the quarters, his remedies administered with whispered instructions and warnings never to reveal where the healing had come from. The white world saw him as a small, quiet houseboy, forgettable and powerless. The quarters knew him as something else entirely, a bridge between the old knowledge and the new survival, a child who carried in his small hands the compressed wisdom of generations. He moved through both worlds with practiced ease, his intelligence hidden behind a mask of servility so perfect that even Joshua Whitmore, who prided himself on knowing every asset on his plantation, had never truly seen the boy who carried his water and stoked his fires. Leave in the comments, never give up on truth if you believe justice should reach all the oppressed. The atrocities of Whitmore Plantation escalated in the months before Margaret's illness, each horror layered upon the last, until the very air seemed to thicken with injustice. In March, a young man named Isaiah had been whipped 39 times for the crime of looking directly at Margaret as she passed on the carriage road. The skin of his back transformed into something that no longer resembled human flesh, his screams echoing across the rice fields for 3 days until infection silenced him permanently. Samuel had watched from the kitchen doorway, had seen his mother's hands tremble as she carried lemonade to the gallery, where the white family sat discussing the weather, while Isaiah's blood soaked into the dirt behind the barn. In April, a woman named Dinah, heavily pregnant, had been sold away from her husband and 3 children because Whitmore needed cash to purchase new milling equipment. The family's cries as the slave trader's wagon rolled away becoming part of the plantation's permanent soundtrack. a ghost sound that seemed to rise from the soil itself during quiet moments. Samuel had carried Margaret's breakfast tray that morning, had served her soft-boiled eggs and fresh cream, while her father counted the money from Dinah's sale in the next room. The coincidence of these two acts occurring simultaneously creating a juxtaposition so obscene that the boy had felt something crack inside his chest. In May, an elderly man named Cato, who had served the Whitmore family for 60 years, had been denied medical care for a treatable infection because Joshua Whitmore deemed the expense unjustified for someone no longer capable of field work. And Samuel had watched the old man die slowly in the quarters, his body consuming itself while the great house physician was summoned twice in the same week to treat Margaret's headaches and her mother's vapors. The boy began to understand something fundamental about the world he inhabited, that certain lives were considered infinitely valuable, while others could be discarded like broken tools, that suffering and luxury could exist within 100 yards of each other without the inhabitants of either world acknowledging the other's humanity. He witnessed how Margaret could weep over a dead songbird while remaining utterly unmoved by the sale of Dinah's children, how her father could speak eloquently about Christian duty on Sunday, while on Monday calculating the most efficient way to extract labor from bodies he would never consider fully human. Each atrocity Samuel witnessed etched itself into his consciousness, transformed him from a child into something harder, something that understood the profound moral sickness that allowed human beings to inflict such calculated cruelty. He began to watch the White family differently, no longer with the automatic deference his mother had taught him, but with an analytical coldness that mapped their weaknesses even as he performed his duties with perfect submission. When Margaret laughed at dinner parties, Samuel catalogued the sound. When Joshua Whitmore raged about abolitionists, the boy noted the purple vein that appeared in his temple. When Mrs. Whitmore complained about the impossible burden of managing household servants, Samuel memorized her habits, her routines, her dependencies. He did not yet know why he was gathering this information, what possible use a 12-year-old slave child could make of understanding the intimate details of his oppressors' lives. But some instinct, some survival mechanism born of accumulated trauma, told him that knowledge was the only form of power available to him, and so he collected it obsessively, compulsively, storing every detail in a mind that had become a detailed map of the plantation's power structures and their hidden vulnerabilities. The trauma that would change everything arrived on a humid June evening when Samuel was returning from the spring house with fresh butter for the dinner table. He passed the stable and heard sounds that made him freeze, a rhythmic grunting and high keening that he initially could not identify. Through a gap in the weathered boards, he saw Crenshaw the overseer with Samuel's cousin Mercy, 15 years old, her face pressed against the stable wall, while Crenshaw satisfied himself with the casual entitlement of a man who had never once considered that his actions might carry consequences. Samuel stood paralyzed, the butter beginning to melt in his hands, watching an assault that the entire plantation structure was designed to make invisible, to make permissible, to make simply another aspect of the natural order. When it was finished, Crenshaw adjusted his clothing and walked away whistling, while Mercy slid down the wall and sat in the hay, her eyes fixed on nothing, her whole body shaking in a way that had nothing to do with cold. Samuel approached slowly, set down the butter, knelt beside her without speaking. She looked at him finally, and in her eyes he saw something die, some essential spark of selfhood extinguished by the realization that her body was not her own, had never been her own, would never be her own as long as she lived within the boundaries of Whitmore Plantation. That night, in the quarters, Grandmother Essie prepared a strong tea from valerian root and skullcap, held Mercy while she drank it, sang the old songs that had no English words, songs of grief and endurance that had crossed the ocean in the holds of slave ships and survived because they carried truths that could not be killed. Samuel watched his grandmother work, watched how her gnarled hands moved with such tenderness, how her voice could contain both sorrow and defiance simultaneously, and he made a silent vow that he did not fully understand, a promise sealed in the witnessing of his cousin's destruction. He did not swear revenge, because what revenge could a child take against a system so vast and so protected? Instead, he swore attention, swore to see everything, to forget nothing, to let no cruelty pass unrecorded in the ledger of his memory. He would become a witness, a living archive of every sin committed within the boundaries of this plantation. And somehow, someday, that witnessing would matter. Mercy herself spoke only once more about that night, 3 days later when she could finally meet Samuel's eyes, and what she said was simply this: "Remember me. Not remember this, not remember what happened, but remember me. Remember that I existed as a person before this, that I had thoughts and dreams that were mine, that I was human even though they treated me like I was not." And Samuel did remember, carried her words like a talisman, understood that she had given him a sacred task, the preservation of personhood in the face of systems designed to erase it. The plantation's antagonists existed in layers, each more terrible than the last, a hierarchy of cruelty that extended from casual to calculated to zealously refined. At the top sat Joshua Whitmore himself, a man who considered himself enlightened compared to his more brutal neighbors, who prided himself on rarely using the whip personally, who genuinely believed that his paternalistic care for his property made him morally superior to those who treated their slaves with open savagery. His cruelty was therefore worse, precisely because it was systematic, reasoned, justified by economic theory and biblical interpretation, built into the very structure of the plantation's operation. He kept detailed health records on his slaves the way other planters kept records on livestock, noting who was prone to respiratory illness, who healed slowly from injuries, who had borne children successfully, and who had lost them, all in service of maximizing the return on his human investment. His wife, Catherine Whitmore, practiced a different variety of evil, the kind that came wrapped in Christian charity and feminine delicacy, punishing enslaved women for imagined slights with quiet viciousness, reducing their rations, assigning the most degrading tasks, creating a constant atmosphere of capricious terror masked as household management. She would pray loudly each Sunday for the souls of the enslaved people, then return home and deny medical care to a sick child because the mother had been insufficiently grateful for some cast-off dress. Crenshaw, the overseer, represented the most visible face of plantation violence, but his brutality served a purpose in the system. He was the instrument through which the theoretical cruelty of the Whitmores became practical reality, the man whose hands actually wielded the whip so that Joshua could maintain his self-image as a benevolent patriarch. Below them existed a network of lesser antagonists, the white artisans and overseers who competed for favor by demonstrating their loyalty through zealous enforcement, the slave drivers, black men given minimal authority over their own people and forced to participate in their oppression as the price of marginally better treatment for themselves. But the catalyzing event, the final straw that would make the impossible necessary, came not from the expected sources. In July 1847, a traveling physician named Dr. Bartholomew Hendricks arrived at Whitmore Plantation, a specialist in tropical diseases summoned from Charleston to consult on chronic malaria issues among the field workers. Hendricks was a different breed of monster, a man who saw enslaved bodies not as property to be maintained, but as experimental subjects, who believed that black people felt pain differently than whites and could therefore be used to test theories that would be unconscionable to attempt on civilized patients. Samuel was assigned to assist him during his week-long stay, to carry his medical bag, to help prepare his instruments, to hold down patients during examinations that crossed rapidly from diagnostic to sadistic. The boy watched Hendricks perform surgery without anesthesia on a young woman's infected leg, claiming that her people had a natural tolerance for pain that made such measures unnecessary. Watched him take detailed notes while she screamed herself unconscious. He saw the doctor lance boils and drain abscesses and set broken bones with clinical detachment, treating human suffering as data, as information to be recorded in journals that would never acknowledge the humanity of their subjects. And he saw Hendricks in conversation with Joshua Whitmore, discussing breeding practices and nutritional theories and the most efficient protocols for maintaining a workforce in South Carolina's disease-prone climate. The two men smoking cigars on the gallery while they debated whether separating mothers from children before age 5 or after produced better long-term psychological compliance. On Hendricks' final night at the plantation, he performed an autopsy on an enslaved man who had died of unknown causes, and he required Samuel to assist, to hold the lantern while he opened the body and examined the organs, providing educational commentary about anatomical features he claimed were unique to the Negro race. Samuel stood there, 12 years old, holding the light steady while this supposed man of science transformed a human being into an object lesson, and something inside the boy calcified into pure resolve, a determination so complete it felt like a physical transformation. He understood finally that the evil he faced was not simply individual cruelty, but an entire intellectual and moral framework that had convinced itself of its own righteousness, that had built elaborate theories to justify the unjustifiable, that had turned healing itself into another instrument of oppression. When Hendricks finally departed, Samuel returned to the quarters and vomited until nothing remained inside him, then sat in the darkness listening to Grandmother Essie explain that this was the nature of the world they inhabited, that power corrupted everything it touched, turned even medicine into torture, even science into brutality. And the old woman added one more thing, quietly, looking directly into Samuel's eyes. But knowledge does not belong to them alone, child. They think their learning makes them superior, but they do not know what we know. They do not carry what we carry. And someday, when they need what only we possess, we will have to decide what price that knowledge commands. 3 weeks after Hendricks' departure, Samuel experienced his own public humiliation, the kind of degradation designed to destroy not just dignity, but the possibility of resistance. Margaret Whitmore had lost a silver hairbrush, an imported item her mother had given her for her 17th birthday, and Mrs. Whitmore, convinced it had been stolen by one of the house servants, ordered all of them assembled in the main hall. Samuel stood with 6 other enslaved children, while Crenshaw systematically searched their cabin spaces, tearing apart the meager possessions that represented their entire material existence. When the brush was finally found, it was in Margaret's own room, fallen behind her dressing table, but no apology was offered, no acknowledgement of the accusation's falseness. Instead, Mrs. Whitmore declared that the incident proved how easily valuable items could be lost and ordered, that henceforth all house servants would be subject to random searches at her discretion, their quarters inspected weekly to ensure no stolen property was being concealed. Samuel felt the weight of this pronouncement, understood that it was not about a hairbrush at all, but about reinforcing the fundamental truth that nothing belonged to him, not his space, not his privacy, not even the most basic assumption of innocence. The other servants accepted this with practiced resignation, but something in Samuel had changed in the weeks since witnessing Hendricks' experiments, since holding that lantern over that opened body. That evening, after returning to the quarters, he looked at his small collection of possessions, a carved wooden bird his mother had given him, a smooth river stone he used for grinding herbs, a scrap of cloth where he kept his dried plants, and he understood with sudden clarity that these items existed only at the plantation's sufferance, that everything could be taken from him at any moment for any reason or no reason at all. The humiliation was not the search itself, but the revelation of his absolute vulnerability, the confirmation that he existed in a state of permanent violation, where even the illusion of privacy was a privilege that could be revoked on a white woman's whim. He sat outside his mother's cabin that night, watching fireflies pulse in the darkness, and he made his decision. Not a plan yet, because planning required opportunity, but a fundamental choice about who he would be in this world that was designed to make him nothing. He would not accept powerlessness as his permanent condition. He would wait and watch and learn. And when the moment came, when the impossible intersection of need and knowledge arrived, he would act. He did not know what that action would look like, could not imagine a scenario where his knowledge would give him leverage against people who owned not just his labor, but his very existence. But he trusted what Grandmother Essie had taught him. That knowledge was a form of power that could not be confiscated in a search, could not be sold away with the rest of his possessions, could not be beaten out of him with Crenshaw's whip. He possessed something they needed without knowing they needed it, carried something they would eventually want without understanding its value, and when that moment came, he would be ready. The planning began in Samuel's mind the way a storm gathers on the horizon, not with conscious intent but with the accumulation of elements that would eventually become unstoppable. He intensified his education with Grandmother Essie, spending every spare moment learning the properties of every plant that grew within walking distance of the plantation, mastering not just their healing properties but their dangers, the doses that could cure versus the doses that could kill, the combinations that could bring relief versus the combinations that could induce symptoms indistinguishable from natural disease. The old woman sensed the change in her grandson, the new edge to his questions, the careful attention he paid to toxicology, to the plants that could affect the heart or the lungs or the mind. She never asked directly what he intended, but she taught him everything, understanding that knowledge itself was neutral, that the same wisdom could heal or harm depending on the wielder's choice and the circumstances that demanded choosing. Samuel also began mapping the great house's routines with obsessive detail, noting when the family took their meals, which servants prepared which dishes, how food moved from kitchen to table, where opportunities for intervention existed in that chain of handling and serving. He identified the other enslaved people whose skills would be necessary if any complex action were required. Josiah the blacksmith, who could work metal into any shape. Esther the seamstress, who understood the layout of every room in the great house from years of measuring for curtains and upholstery. His own mother Abana, who moved through the house like water, invisible and essential simultaneously. He did not recruit them, not yet, but he cataloged their abilities, their trustworthiness, their capacity for secrecy. Most importantly, he studied the Whitmore family's vulnerabilities, their dependencies, the ways they had built their lives around the assumption of invulnerability. Joshua Whitmore's heart condition, carefully hidden but occasionally visible in the way he gripped his chest during moments of stress. Margaret's headaches, increasingly severe and frequent, treated with laudanum that made her drowsy and irritable. Mrs. Whitmore's dependence on her enslaved maid Hannah for literally every aspect of her daily routine, unable to dress herself or arrange her own hair, or manage the most basic tasks of personal care. Samuel gathered this information without knowing precisely how it would be used, building a mental architecture of opportunity and weakness, waiting for the moment when theory would become practice. That moment announced itself on August 15th, when Margaret's headaches transformed into something worse, when the young woman who had smiled at Dinah's sale and remained unmoved by Isaiah's whipping suddenly found herself facing a crisis that all her privilege could not solve. The fever came first, then the confusion, then the seizures that made her body arch and thrash while her eyes rolled back to show only whites. Dr. Morrison was summoned from Beaufort, examined her, prescribed rest and cold compresses, left after collecting his fee. The fever worsened. Dr. Pemberton came from Charleston, tried bloodletting, tried purgatives, tried everything in his considerable arsenal, left after 3 days with an apology and no improvement. Dr. Hendricks himself was telegraphed, made the journey from Charleston again, this time without his experimental enthusiasm, because the patient was white and valuable, and he genuinely did not know what was wrong. Cerebral malaria, he suggested, though the presentation was unusual. Encephalitis, perhaps, though he had no treatment. Brain fever of unknown origin, he finally admitted, and told Joshua Whitmore to prepare for the worst while he collected his substantial fee and departed quickly, unwilling to be associated with a failure. And Samuel watched it all from his position serving water and fetching towels. Watched these educated men with their medical degrees and their Latin terminology and their absolute confidence in their own superiority fail completely. Watched Margaret decline despite everything her father's money could purchase. Watched Joshua Whitmore's face transform from imperious command to desperate helplessness. The man who had sold away Dinah's children without a second thought now wept openly in his study. The man who had let Cato die of a treatable infection now offered any price to anyone who could save his daughter. And Samuel understood that the impossible moment had arrived, that the inversion Grandmother Essie had predicted was happening in real time, that the powerless child suddenly possessed the only thing the powerful man needed. The night before Samuel acted, the entire plantation held its breath in a strange suspension of normal operation. In the great house, Margaret lay in her canopied bed, unconscious now more often than awake, her breathing shallow and irregular, her skin burning with fever that refused to break despite the constant application of cool cloths and the desperate prayers of her mother. The family physician had been sent for again, had examined her one more time, had simply shaken his head and suggested making her comfortable medical code, for there is nothing more to be done. In the parlor, Joshua Whitmore sat with his account books open but unread, his pen motionless in his hand, his empire of rice and human beings suddenly meaningless in the face of losing his only child. On the gallery, Mrs. Whitmore directed servants in pointless tasks, rearranging flowers, polishing silver that was already polished, maintaining the illusion of control even as control itself was slipping away. The enslaved household staff moved through their duties with careful faces, showing neither satisfaction nor sympathy, understanding that any visible emotion could be dangerous, that the grief of white people often translated into rage against the nearest available target. In the quarters, a different atmosphere prevailed. People spoke in whispers about the great house's crisis, about what it might mean for all of them if Margaret died, whether Joshua's grief would make him more dangerous or less, whether the plantation would be sold or divided, or simply continue under darker leadership. Grandmother Essie sat outside her cabin, smoking a clay pipe, watching the great house's lit windows like distant stars, and she knew, with the certainty of someone who had seen this pattern before, that her grandson was about to cross a threshold from which there would be no return. Samuel himself moved through that day in a state of crystalline awareness, every sense heightened, every detail magnified, understanding that he was approaching a moment that would define not just his own life, but potentially the lives of everyone on the plantation. He had prepared his materials, gathered specific plants from the swamp in the pre-dawn darkness, plants whose properties he had studied for years under his grandmother's tutelage, cattail roots and wild ginger and willow bark and something else, something that only the old knowledge recognized, a root that grew in the deepest parts of the swamp where enslaved people were forbidden to go. He had extracted and combined these materials using techniques Grandmother Essie had taught him, creating a preparation that could potentially break the fever, reduce the brain inflammation, pull Margaret back from whatever edge she was approaching. But he had not acted yet, had not revealed his knowledge, had continued serving and fetching and remaining invisible, while the white doctors exhausted their expertise and departed. Because this was not simply about healing, could not be simply about healing. When the same family that now wept for their daughter had remained unmoved by countless deaths in the quarters, when the same man who now offered any price for his child's recovery had calculated the exact monetary value of separating mothers from their children, Samuel understood that if he healed Margaret, it would not be an act of mercy or compassion or Christian charity. It would be a calculated choice about survival and leverage and the complex mathematics of power in a system where he had none. As night fell, he stood outside the kitchen house looking at the great house's windows, at the lamplight that seemed to pulse with the same irregular rhythm as Margaret's labored breathing, and he made his final decision. He would kneel before Joshua Whitmore, would offer his knowledge, would attempt to save the girl whose family had caused so much death and suffering. Not because she deserved saving, but because in this specific moment, her life was the only currency that could purchase what he needed, what all of them needed. And what they needed was not gratitude or freedom, or even basic human recognition. What they needed was the permanent understanding that their knowledge had value, that their lives contained worth beyond their labor, that they possessed power that could not be bought or sold or whipped out of existence. The healing would be his declaration of that truth, and whatever came after would be the plantation's response to a reality it had spent centuries denying. Samuel walked into the great house through the back entrance, moving through the kitchen where the evening meal preparations had been abandoned, through the dining room where uneaten food congealed on china plates, through the hall where family portraits watched with painted eyes. He climbed the main staircase, his bare feet silent on the imported carpet runner, past the landing where a grandfather clock marked time with impassive certainty, toward the second floor where Margaret's room glowed with desperate lamplight. Outside her door stood Abina, his mother, her face unreadable as she registered her son's presence, the small cloth bundle he carried, the determination in his posture. She started to speak, to warn or forbid or question, but Samuel shook his head minutely and she stepped aside, understanding that this moment had its own terrible momentum, that whatever her son was about to do could not be stopped by maternal concern. Inside the room, Joshua Whitmore sat beside his daughter's bed, holding her hand, his face ravaged by exhaustion and fear and the novel experience of absolute helplessness. Mrs. Whitmore stood at the window, her back to the room, her shoulders shaking with silent crying. Neither of them noticed Samuel's entrance at first, their attention consumed by Margaret's increasingly labored breathing, by the rattle that had begun to accompany each exhalation, the sound that preceded death by perhaps hours, perhaps less. Samuel crossed to the bed, knelt beside Joshua Whitmore, and spoke for the first time in his life without being spoken to first, without being summoned or commanded or questioned. "Master Whitmore," he said, his voice quiet but clear, "I can help her. The words hung in the air like something solid, like an impossible object that violated all the natural laws of the plantation's social physics. Joshua turned slowly, his face transforming from grief to confusion, to something close to rage. Because how dare this child, this property, this thing interrupt this moment with such presumption? But before he could speak, before he could call for Crenshaw to remove this insolent boy, Samuel continued. "The fever comes from bad blood in the brain," he said, speaking with the calm authority of knowledge that could not be questioned, words learned from grandmother Essie, who had learned them from her mother who had carried them across the ocean. "The white doctors, they only know how to cut and bleed and purge, but that makes it worse, makes the body weak when it needs to be strong. I have medicine that can break the fever, that can reduce the swelling, that can bring her back." Mrs. Whitmore had turned from the window now, her face caught between desperate hope and social horror at the transgression of this enslaved child, claiming knowledge that white physicians did not possess. Joshua Whitmore stared at Samuel, and in that stare the boy could see the entire architecture of the man's worldview cracking. The fundamental assumptions about civilization and savagery, knowledge and ignorance, power and powerlessness, all of it fracturing under the weight of this impossible moment. "You?" Joshua finally managed, the word thick with disbelief. "You can save her when 3 doctors from Charleston have failed?" Samuel met his eyes directly, another transgression, and nodded once. "Yes, sir. The old knowledge, the African medicine, it works different from the white doctor's way. I learned from my grandmother who learned from hers who was a healer before the ships. I have prepared medicine from plants that grow in the swamp, plants the white doctors do not know about because they think everything worth knowing comes from their books. But Miss Margaret is dying, sir, and your doctors have no more answers, and I am telling you that I can bring her back if you will let me try." The calculation that crossed Joshua Whitmore's face in that moment was ugly and transparent, weighing his daughter's life against the fundamental order of his world, measuring whether he could accept healing from hands he had been taught to see as subhuman, without destroying everything he believed about his own superiority. But Margaret chose that moment to convulse, her body arching off the bed, foam appearing at the corners of her mouth, and that calculation simplified into something primal, into fatherly love stripped of ideology, into the basic desperate math of losing everything that mattered versus accepting help from any source. "Do it," he said hoarsely. "Whatever you need to do it now." Samuel unwrapped his cloth bundle, revealing the prepared medicine, a thick, dark paste that smelled of earth and something sharper, something green and alive. He also produced a tea he had already prepared, carried carefully in a small bottle he had taken from the kitchen. He moved with practiced confidence, asking Abena to help prop Margaret into a semi-sitting position, carefully administering a small amount of the paste under her tongue, then slowly pouring the tea between her lips, while massaging her throat to encourage swallowing. The room filled with the scent of willow and ginger and that other element, that ancient knowledge that had no English name. For 10 minutes nothing changed. Margaret remained unconscious, her breathing still labored, and Joshua Whitmore's face began to harden with the realization that he had allowed himself to hope in something ridiculous, that he had violated the natural order for nothing. But then Margaret's breathing shifted, became deeper, more regular, the rattle fading from her exhalations. The fever flush on her cheeks began to pale, sweat breaking across her forehead as the medicine forced the heat from her body. Her eyes moved beneath closed lids, rapid flickering that indicated dreaming rather than unconsciousness, a return to natural sleep rather than the coma's void. By dawn, the fever had broken completely, and Margaret opened her eyes, confused but lucid, asking for water in a voice that was weak but unmistakably alive. The impossible had occurred in that room, the complete inversion of every assumption the plantation was built upon, and everyone present understood that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The days following Margaret's recovery transformed the plantation's hidden dynamics in ways that remained largely invisible to white eyes, but resonated through the quarters like a sustained bell tone. Joshua Whitmore, true to his nature, did not grant Samuel freedom, did not acknowledge that the child's knowledge had proven superior to trained physicians, did not publicly credit the healing to anything other than God's mercy and his daughter's strong constitution. But he also did not punish the boy for his presumption, did not return him immediately to the anonymity of general labor, instead keeping him close to the house in an undefined capacity that everyone recognized as both reward and containment. Margaret herself, once recovered enough to speak coherently, asked to see Samuel, and in that brief meeting thanked him with genuine tears, a moment of human recognition that lasted perhaps 30 seconds before the social order reasserted itself, and she returned to treating him as furniture. But among the enslaved community, Samuel's action had accomplished something far more significant than gratitude or even freedom would have provided. He had demonstrated that their knowledge possessed power, that the old ways carried value that white learning could not match, that there existed forms of expertise that existed outside the plantation's official hierarchies. Grandmother Essie became sought after in ways she had never been before, people coming to her with ailments they had previously suffered in silence, understanding now that African medicine was not simply superstition, but a legitimate alternative to the white doctors who saw black bodies as experimental subjects rather than patients deserving care. Other plantations began to hear whispers about what had happened at Whitmore, about the enslaved boy who had succeeded where Charleston's finest physicians had failed, and enslaved healers throughout the Low Country found themselves suddenly valued in new ways, their knowledge moving from the shadows into a kind of grudging recognition. Samuel himself had changed in that moment of kneeling before Joshua Whitmore, had crossed from childhood into something else, had claimed a form of agency that most enslaved people never achieved. He understood now that power was not simply about freedom or ownership, but about possessing something others needed desperately enough to temporarily forget the rules that governed their world. The story of Samuel's healing spread through the network of enslaved people like fire through dry rice stalks, carried by those who witnessed it, embellished by those who heard it secondhand, transformed by those who recognized its symbolic power. Within months, similar accounts began emerging from plantations across South Carolina and Georgia, stories of enslaved healers who had saved white lives when white medicine failed, who had used that moment of inversion to negotiate small improvements in conditions, to protect family members from sale, to establish a fragile but real form of leverage. The Whitmore case became a reference point, a template, evidence that certain kinds of knowledge could not be beaten or bought or legislated out of existence. White planters, pragmatic men despite their ideologies, began to quietly value the healers among their enslaved populations, not out of respect for their humanity, but out of recognition that when fever season came, when doctors were days away and death was hours close, these despised people possessed skills that could save white lives and therefore white wealth. Medical journals began publishing cautious articles about Negro folk remedies, academically examining knowledge they had previously dismissed as primitive superstition, trying to extract and systematize and claim ownership of healing practices they could not replicate. But the knowledge itself remained stubbornly resistant to such appropriation, because it was not simply a matter of which plant to use, but how to prepare it, when to harvest it, how to combine it with other elements. Wisdom that required relationship with the land and trust between healer and patient, elements that could not be reduced to Latin terminology and written prescriptions. Samuel lived another 43 years, never granted freedom during Joshua Whitmore's lifetime, but never quite enslaved in the same way either, existing in a liminal space where his value as a healer protected him from the worst excesses, while still denying him basic human rights. He trained others in the quarters, passing Grandmother Essie's knowledge to a new generation, creating a lineage of healers who would survive even after emancipation, who would become the root doctors and conjure women and herbalists of the post-war South. The method itself, this particular form of resistance through indispensable knowledge, this way of surviving by becoming too valuable to destroy completely, spread throughout the enslaved South and became part of the complex strategies through which people maintained humanity and agency within a system designed to erase both. The final paradox of Samuel's story rests in what it reveals about power and survival in systems of absolute oppression. He did not escape slavery through his knowledge, did not purchase freedom or spark rebellion, or fundamentally change the plantation structure. What he did was far more subtle and perhaps more radical. He forced a moment of recognition, created a crack in the edifice of white supremacy's certainty, demonstrated that value and worth existed in places the system claimed were worthless. Every time Joshua Whitmore looked at the daughter Samuel had saved, he confronted an uncomfortable truth that threatened the entire intellectual framework justifying slavery. The truth that sometimes the enslaved possessed knowledge the master desperately needed, that power was more complex and conditional than the plantation's legal structure admitted. That cognitive dissonance, multiplied across thousands of similar moments throughout the South, contributed to the slow erosion of slavery's moral certainty, to the growing recognition that the system was built on lies about human capacity and human worth. Samuel's story became legend in the quarters, told and retold until it transformed into something larger than one boy and one healing, until it became a parable about the permanence of knowledge, the impossibility of completely erasing cultural memory, the stubborn survival of African wisdom in American soil. The song sung about him never used his name directly, encoded his story in metaphor and symbol, the young healer who walked between worlds, who carried power in his hands that chains could not hold, who knelt before the master but never truly bowed. When Samuel died in 1890, the year of his mother Abina's death, his funeral drew healers from across 3 states, people who had learned from him or learned from those he taught, who understood that they were burying not just a man, but a bridge between the old knowledge and the new world, between Africa and America, between enslavement and the freedom that was still being negotiated and contested and fought for in the decades after emancipation. He was buried in the Freedmen's Cemetery outside Beaufort, and on his grave his students placed medicines he had taught them to make, roots and herbs that would decompose back into the soil, a final offering of knowledge returning to the earth from which it came. The historical record barely acknowledges his existence. A few mentions in Whitmore family papers about the Negro boy who treated Margaret's fever, a footnote in a medical journal about indigenous healing practices, nothing that captures the full weight of what he represented or what he accomplished. But in the oral histories of the Gullah communities, in the practices of traditional healers who still work in the Lowcountry, in the very fact that African medical knowledge survived the Middle Passage and slavery and systematic cultural erasure, Samuel's legacy persists. If you watched until here, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here, so I can know you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth." Like this video if Samuel's story touched your heart. Share it so that the memory of Samuel and all the enslaved healers like him are never forgotten. Their knowledge saved lives. Their courage preserved culture. Their existence proved that humanity cannot be legislated away, that worth cannot be determined by laws written to deny it, that some forms of power survive even in chains.